So, okay, back in 2019, polls found that the police were one of the most trusted public figures in America, more trustworthy than Congress, journalists, or religious leaders. Yet, recent events have called into question the institution itself, with many campaigners calling for total police reform or the demolition of the police entirely. With this change, I've begun to realize that we should probably look into our own relationship with notable police figures in literature and media. I want to use this opportunity to explore this affair between the police and screen, what sort of narrative the police play in Hollywood. By doing this, we could try to explore if what we see on screen have any effect on the way we view the police in real life. And with the Black Lives Matter's commitment to ending police brutality, is the way our on-screen relationship with the police going to change as well? The ability of real-life police departments to maintain order is based so much on image, and a large portion of the policeman's image is influenced by the entertainment industry. Hollywood police stories have reinforced myths about cops and the work of policing. By exploring the political importance and televisual representation, we can trace how these representations have played a key role in shaping public perception of the police as an institution. I do want to quickly mention that in this case study, I will largely focus on American policing and reform. As Hollywood is one of the US's biggest exports, they have direct interest and conflict with the police of that nation. However, I do want to stress that the criticisms of police brutality and policing as an institution does translate beyond country, as each culture has their own unique problems. So firstly, police films. Writer Thomas Leach writes in his book Crime Films, the conventional behavior of police heroes, from their maverick attitudes to their ubiquitous car chases, is so well established that it's easy to forget how dramatically it departs from the behavior of most police officers. Valerie Jarrett told Vice in a 2017 article during the Ferguson riots that pop culture has a significant impact on the lens through which people view the relationship between police and communities of color. They humanize stories in a way that doesn't come across in a 24-hour news cycle. They bring people closer to issues they may not experience in their own life. And that's where the empathy begins. For me, this can be said for many characters and professions that are explored on screen, from doctors to assassins. It is the medium of television and film that engages audiences to empathize with those that they will not normally meet, revealing the inner workings of a myriad of people and culture. Through this, the world becomes smaller and more familiar. However, Chirac continues to state that pop culture is evolving, and just as the news media has woken up to the problems of police shootings, thanks to the use of smartphones and dashboard cameras, so too have content creators become cognizant of the realities of the justice system. So, firstly, I want to explore the evolution of on-screen police by going back to the very first time that the police appeared in films and what that meant. By going back to the silent era, we saw how police were seen as allies and part of a comedic ensemble. The police were either good or bad, depending on which side the protagonist was. We explore even the technical elements of the police, like how they would be grouped together to appear more monolithic. There was no one we can relate to. Instead, the camera convinced us that they were all one separate entity. So, why cops? In those early days of film, much of the movie-going audiences was made up of working-class immigrants. Directors knew this and knew these blue-collar people would get a kick out of authority figures being humiliated. The most familiar authority figure? The police. The most popular example was the Keystone Cops, a group of bumbling, idiotic officers who starred in serials between 1912 to 1917. The Keystone Cops tended to act as impersonal jumble of policemen, rather than having a clear-cut character. Often supporting actors would also double up as cops in this very same film. As law enforcement agencies professionalized standards and conduct at the beginning of the 20th century, cinema developed along the same lines, moving away from the silent era to the talkie. However, through this we can see that the portrayal of officers from the start were negative. This dichotomy has continued to this day, which one can argue is a reflection of the conflicted police identity. Constance Grady writes for Vox that there is a gap between the ways in which the police behave and the way the public perceives them. And for a long time, police behaved as though they thought pop culture is responsible for that gap. But it was kind of true. The movies did tend to make the police look ridiculous. Police in pop culture of the 1910s were inept buffoons to be mocked and ridiculed, and the real-life police reacted with outrage. Grady explains that the ridiculous police of 1910s pop culture didn't come out of nowhere. The police of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were widely understood to be a corrupt gang without reason. The infamous Lexo Commission of the 1890s found that the police extorted $10 million from the public each year in the state of New York alone, and that they also regularly harassed citizens. That report drove 30 years of police reform efforts, but for most of the public's perception, the police's reputation as a pack of hired goons was fact. However, this began to change in the early part of the 20th century, when the Supreme Court passed a statute across the states to protect the health, morals, and safety of their citizens. This was called the Hays Code, and it was the police power that was central to the emergence of state censorship. Alyssa Rosenberg explains in her piece at the Washington Post that as Hollywood grew larger, cooperation with the police and other law enforcement agencies became more important for reasons beyond censorship. Hollywood needed the cooperation of the Los Angeles Police Department to preserve its stars' reputations. The cooperation between the movie business and the police ensured discretion for its wayward stars. The increasingly complex Hollywood productions created strong logistical imperatives for the movie-making business to play nice with the police. And decades later, this relationship continues, as movie studios need permits to shoot on city streets and police officers to enforce those permits. So in order for the police to play nice, Hollywood needed the police to be played, well, nice. As Hollywood rolled through the 20s and 30s, the film industry really came into its own after World War II. This was through the genre of film noir. This was a pivotal time in Western cinema. Using cinematography found in German Expressionism, film noir used intense shadows and lighting to portray a complex world inhabited by even more complex characters. These films were usually led by a male lead whose occupation was integral to the plot. Occupations had to relate with the investigating of a crime. So we had characters that were private eyes, insurance investigators, and police. Leach continues to write that police officers who embody clear-cut motives but in contrast were routinely cast as loners. The lonely isolation of the Hollywood cop is the most immutable of all genre conventions. Police officers in these movies never have a happy, stable family life. More often, the hero is a loner from the very beginning, a man whose private life is deviant, dysfunctional, or non-existent. Like the Western hero, the police hero is deprived of a domestic life in order to marginalize him from the social body he is supposed to be defending. Even in this alienation is reinforced by his own professional dedication. This reflection of the loner police is explored in many film noirs. This male character is a visual representation of the isolation and trauma felt by most men in America after the Second World War. This trauma and isolation is reflected in narratives where there's no one they can trust, but a duty they must fulfill. This isolation is often institutional, emphasizing the conflicts between the police and the legislative branches, such as legislators, lawyers, judges, anyone else who gets in their way. They are often cast as the real enemies of society because they won't give the investigative agencies the power they need. So it's easy to see how we root for the rogue cop that does whatever he takes to get the criminal, even if it means breaking the law he is meant to protect. Skipping ahead to the 50s, we can see how the popular film noir evolved into another popular American genre, the Western. It could be said that Western films really were a cinematic demonstration of white American identity. Like film noir, the Westerns usually starred a white male lead using their power and authority to save the community, usually from Native Americans. This idea of the protector has once again translated into the isolated rogue loner. However, due to historical accuracy, you will less likely see a police officer, or more likely, the sheriff. In many crime stories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the policeman is an agent of high modern civilization. Police become enforcers first and foremost, also have a dual narrative of becoming investigators. Gradually, Westerns shape the sheriff in both these directions. However, while there was no obvious policing in Western movies, it was television that took a swing in portraying the police, and this was in the form of the TV show Dragnet. Created and starred Jack Webb, what began in 1949 as a radio show ultimately blossomed into a sprawling franchise. The premise of Dragnet was that it was revealing to the world the authentic truth of what it was like to be a police officer fighting crime. Narrator Jack Webb promised the beginning of every episode what they were about to see was authentic.
The story you were about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Okay, so let's get one thing clear. Dragnet was not neutral in its politics. Writer and pop culture scholar Roger Sabin writes in his book Cop Shows that Dragnet was a vision of the police force as a stabilizer in society, made up of honest men dedicated to keeping the bad guys in their place. Dragnet presented the police to the public the way the police wanted to be seen, as aspirational heroes. In 1951, however, the same year that Dragnet premiered, multiple members of the LAPD assaulted 7 civilians, leaving 5 Latino men and 2 white men hospitalized with broken bones and ruptured organs. Racially motivated violence against civilians was and is still part of the reality of the police force. But Webb and his collaborators at the LAPD deliberately hid that reality, giving us the fantasy of the hero cop instead, leaving Dragnet to become what was essentially police propaganda. Dragnet's Joe Friday bolstered public faith in law and order in the 50s. The vision of policing was a fantasy even then, and it couldn't last. Webb produced Dragnet in close collaboration with the LAPD. It was propaganda for that agency. Despite its problems with racial bias and militarized styles of policing that would continue in the city for years. Rosenberg continues to write that in the 1960s, more than 70% of Americans said that they had a great deal of respect for their local police, and less than 10% said that they believed police brutality was happening in their communities. Film and TV shows of that era reflected this perception, with portrayals of model cops who cared so much about the social services as well as crime fighting. Hollywood depicted a simpler time with simpler policemen. This conceit, however, slowly vanished from the screen after the country survived a major violent crime wave beginning in the 1960s, where studios have mostly failed, offering compelling ideas about what cops ought to be, instead of grim diagnosis of what policing has become. This resulted in protests that quickly transformed into riots as a way to protest the police brutality affecting black people. On Wednesday, 11th of August 1965, the LA neighborhood of Watts quickly escalated as angry residents, tired of years of police brutality, confronted state highway patrolmen. And 3,483 Watts residents were arrested, most on curfew violations. To everyone except black Angelenos, the uprising came as a total surprise. For nearly 20 years, Dragnet had portrayed an efficient, professional, and respectful LAPD. However, most of what we see on TV and cinema is not an accident, but the visual manifestations of a culture's belief and politics. And thus, the LAPD was deeply involved in every stage of Dragnet's production. A team of officers called potential cases, and patrolmen and detectives even wrote up their own cases in the hopes of inspiring an episode. For several years, Dragnet was actually filmed inside a police headquarters, where paid off-duty officers who were on set and gave 6% of the show's profits to the LAPD. When the show debuted, recent state and federal investigations uncovered serious police brutality and police corruption in agencies all across America, including the LAPD. But alongside this public criticism, Dragnet offered a powerful alternative view. Even one reviewer noted back in 1954 that the US completely forgets that it is a nation of cop haters when its eyes are glued on Webb's shows. Webb was reportedly careful not to dramatize too many cases in which the culprits were all from the same racial group. But in reality, the LAPD disproportionately targeted people of color. The civil rights crisis was no longer a Southern problem, but its impact was felt in cities and towns all across America. And thus it became harder for Hollywood to tell credible police stories without coming out as naive to the point of delusion. Skipping ahead to the 80s and 90s, police films became more humorous and action-packed, relying on explosive stunts and intense action sequences. By the time Hollywood started telling stories about heroic cops again, the model had changed. The idea that policing was a social service job was gone, and the vision of cops in action commandos was in. This was partially because of Jaws, which in 1975 made the action-packed blockbuster an essential part of the movie-making business. So, the new fictional police officers graduated with intimate confrontations to dramatic car chases and wild shootouts in heavily armed foes. In the 1950s and 60s, cops agonized over even the most justified shootings. However, in this new generation of action movies, police officers were hesitant to fire their weapons, were portrayed as dupes or even weak. This new tale mirrored police changes in the 80s and 90s, as local chiefs rushed to form SWAT teams and the federal government shipped military surplus gear to the departments around the country. In both fiction and reality, action was exciting. However, as the police were being reimagined into action-strong men, from Die Hard to Terminator to Lethal Weapon and even Police Academy, we were seeing how the police, a source of goodness, were injected with a strong sense of machoism. This hyper-masculinity, however, was something of the white gaze, and while we did have Black and Asian police officers, the default template of white masculinity was, well, white male. This bred into white supremacist ideals of who was wrong and who was right, and when white looked right, what the wrong looked like. An analysis of cop movies argues that manhood involves displays of physical aggression, strength, and violence by contrasting these qualities to women. Movies that portrayed manhood involving physical aggression, strength, and violence were typical of that era. Leach argues that cop movies focus thematically on power more than knowledge, telling stories that empathize with heroes' effectiveness and rightness more than their ability to detect the truth. The hero of the cop action film offer movie-going audiences a potent image of American masculinity as tough, independent, and victorious in a society dominated by crime. The cop remains a popular hero, offering audiences a figure that works through issues of class, gender, and race, as well as embodying the idealization of law enforcement and masculine heroism in American culture. The 80s also saw an emphasis on the hero's relationship to other men, and the genre frequently crossed into buddy film genres. Whereas most Hollywood films stressed the relationship between the hero and the love interest, the cop action film replaces the woman with another man for a contemplation of male coding in the face of anger. The 90s saw a gradual reduction in the number of cop action films as a result of changing social attitudes towards masculinity. Over the last decade, however, the 20th century ideals of masculinity shifted from one embodying brawn over a brain. Nonetheless, militarization of police can be seen in sci-fi aesthetics when it comes to police on screen. And it's this dichotomy of the police being there to protect its citizens creates tension when the same police have military-grade ammunition and impunity. This can be seen to manifest in films like Blade Runner and RoboCop. Like the militarized police, RoboCop has armor and artillery to stop any assailant. It's also worth mentioning that the helmet of RoboCop also kind of mirrors the helmet of many army gear the police wear meant to protect them. Yet visually, this gives the monolithic presence that is popular in police films. Like RoboCop, it features a virtually invisible protagonist with the physical ability to single-handedly stop bad guys. They also have the moral character to justify any means necessary. These larger-than-life portrayals of police add to the mystique of the fearless hero that faces up to the most extreme challenges. While these movies portray obvious extreme versions of police work, the echoes of these themes can be observed in real life. Yet again, we need to talk about how the police are portrayed on the small screen. Because while during the 80s and 90s, Hollywood carried out the tradition of portraying cop protagonists as the ultimate American hero, despite the very real dangers they imposed on communities. This resulted in news coverage openly criticizing the police as an institution, portraying the police as hero or villain or incompetent. Yet, like Dragnet, there was another TV show waiting to call this criticism into question. And this was the show Cops. The 80s and 90s was where we saw a new type of entertainment take place on the screen, and this was reality TV. In the MTV generation, reality TV was a way to show people's most authentic selves and stories, and this extended to police with one of the most popular long-running shows on American television, Cops. Cops aired from 1989 to 2020 and became one of America's most controversial shows on policing. When the show aired, it was revolutionary and essentially created a new paradigm of genre in TV. It demystified the world of policing, one the public had long sought to view. It gave insight into the mindset of officers, the criminal justice system, and the issues the police dealt with. Supporters of the show stated that It humanized officers, gave a better understanding of the profession, creating more empathy to view police as normal people. Despite the show's popularity, there were some criticisms that I think should be noted. Cops, like other reality TV shows, are heavily edited and only include exciting aspects of police work, such as felony, fights, and arrests. Again, paving a way for this mythic fantasy of what police work and what police officers actually look like. TV shows such as Cops created simple action movies with good and bad characters. Part of what is so disturbing about these shows is a complete lack of accountability for the often fascistic political positions. For example, Cops routinely show illegal police harassment and brutality in a positive light. The documentary style of the shows built on a tradition of cinematic realism to suggest that what is being shown is a slice of real life. This portrayal actually furthers the belief that individuals choose their behavior from the same conditions as the viewers. Actions then can only matter of individual choice, and not of the social conditions and limitations that might force someone into committing a crime. Yet, John Langley, creator of the reality series, says that policing has to be put into perspective, that the vast majority of officers are decent, hardworking human beings just trying to do a good job. He says that he's not trying to excuse any bad behavior. He says that it's also complicated. It's so easy to judge when you're seeing one video clip. You see a picture, but not necessarily the big picture. Langley says that in the decades of his show being on air, policing has become more transparent, noting that, among other things, police officers now wear body cameras and smartphones can now record a police officer. He says that one of the primary achievements of Cops has been a way to humanize police officers, so you just don't witness a uniform. While I think Langley's observation on his own show is commendable, it is the rule in virtually every cop show that the police officers are represented sympathetically and have a love of justice. This quest of justice at times in an unjust society where bad guys sometimes win make the traditional cop principled, dedicated, and humane. Jonathan Markovitz writes in his essay, Real Bad Cops, from the inception of the genre, the police have been positioned within frontier mythology as the people who would patrol the moral boundary of societies. And it's not unusual for cop shows to excuse some forms of police misconduct. In shows like Law and Order and NYPD Blue, the complexities of due process are often represented as getting in the way of justice, and officers who violate the rights of the accused are generally seen as acting for the greater good. We see this a lot in films. After the second act, just before the climax, the cop makes an error or misjudges and is reprimanded by either a superior or the state. They're told to get off the case or risk being fired, and the good cop hands in his badge and gun. But it's not over yet, as they take the law into their own hands, killing and destroying whoever they like to get the job done. Now, this is when the audiences cheer. The law isn't there to protect, but is to stop the right people from saving the day. Yet, when it's police officers illegally killing and destroying property, we still align with them. Up until this moment, we have seen them with their families, the sacrifices they've made to get this far, and so we're told to cheer them on. And when they shoot unarmed people, because the unarmed people are criminals, instead of the police officers getting charged for their crimes, they are rewarded. But this trope isn't just used in films, but has shown up time and time again in police-centered programming. We've been captivated by TV shows that feature police, perhaps due to the nature of policing itself, which lends itself nicely to themes of justice, the good guys versus the bad guys, and even the story structure of a whodunit. With A Race Against Time, the job of the police is to open up a whole world of possibilities, to see men at their very worst, and to see the best of men thwart them. Brooklyn Nine-Nine as a show does this superbly. As a sitcom, each episode follows a formulaic set of beats for the audience to engage with. We start the day like the lead, Jake Peralta, played by Andy Samberg, as he is thrust into another case that takes him all around New York. Like him, we the audience find clues and put together pieces, so by the end of the episode, when the bad guy is stopped, it feels that we have solved the case too. Yet, despite this, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, becoming the most self-aware show about the police system, seems to also shy away from the very real dangers that the police have on its own citizens.
I still don't know which it is. Could be either.
Harry Waksberg for Vulture states, "It's not entirely accurate to suggest that Brooklyn Nine-Nine completely ignores the messy, upsetting history of the NYPD, but its way of addressing them only serves to highlight how strange it is to portray a modern NYPD as friendly, cuddly, or colorblind." The Nine-Nine's chief, Ray Holt, played by Andre Braugher, came up with the NYPD as a black gay man in the 1970s.
Hello, I'm Raymond Holt.
Are you here to turn yourself in?
But once you address this police bigotry and violence from the 70s, you have opened the door to a politicized world. You cannot call the past without making an argument about how it's changed. Rosenberg even writes that Brooklyn Nine-Nine used advice from technical advisor Jean Murad to make a more optimistic point of the NYPD. Murad's advice shaped the way the show's depiction of Raymond Holt, a gay black NYPD officer, is then thrust into a position of power. The show doesn't make a Dragnet-like argument that the NYPD has always been perfect, but Brooklyn Nine-Nine does argue that the police departments are capable of reform. One can only hope that in these difficult, painful times, that this can be a mark of great change. But it does bring into question, years from now, future generations will look back on Brooklyn Nine-Nine and ask, did they even know what was going on?
Oh, chills. Literal chills.
It was number 5. Number 5 killed my brother.
Oh my god, I forgot about that part.
Okay, well, that's not strictly fair. Well, yes, law enforcement departments across the country began setting up collaborations with Hollywood, ready to shape the narrative of the police officer in the public's imagination. It's standard for today that cop shows have cop experts as consultants. However, the 21st century police shows tend to be highly critical of the way the police work. For example, The Wire features sympathetic individual cops, but it also depicts police brutality against pathetic and well-developed civilians, and it argues that police departments are structured to encourage that brutality. And even Brooklyn Nine-Nine develops much of its conflict by pitting its well-progressive protagonist cops against more conservative members of the NYPD. Brooklyn Nine-Nine does this by using its black and Hispanic characters as a way to highlight the very real systemic issues that plague NYPD, calling to attention the strange tension of being both a minority and a police officer. Very rarely do black officers in TV or film get shown this dichotomy of having both identities being opposed. This struggle of identities is something that black police officers know too well.
What's wrong?
I got stopped by a cop last night.
Stop for what?
Stopped for walking.
That makes 0 sense unless... Oh crap, I see what happened.
Yeah.
Citing Tasker in the gendered depictions of cop action cinema, she explains that race may also affect the type of cases that are shown in movies and TV. That this might present in action movies concerning black women as police officers. Tasker suggests that the prospect of having a black woman serving as a cop triggers something of a crisis in coding, because blackness is understood within Hollywood to be marginalized and criminal. But strangely, the best example I've seen of this dichotomy is Judy in Zootopia. Having to balance between being a bunny and being a police officer, Judy has to overcome the institutional discrimination in her own police force, while also having to deal with her own internal prejudices against carnivores. Yet, through her keeping her prejudices in check, Judy works with Fox Nick to solve the case and bring about race reform, not just in her own profession, but in the entire city as well. However, unlike Brooklyn Nine-Nine or Zootopia, there are still a large portion of police-centered narratives that actively disengage with the wider discourse around systemic racism. Shows like Blue Bloods, for example, which follows a powerful family in New York with each member operating a different area of the justice system. Blue Bloods is dedicated not to investigate but soothe or diminish the fears around racial bias, either by having the patriarch and lead Frank step in to magically fix the problem. Narratively, these easy outs are yet another convenient loophole of the system, one that allows the brave, upstanding Reagan family to have their cake and eat it too. The Reagans believe deeply in colorblindness. The convenient myth of a colorblind world persists despite all evidence to the contrary, that Black people experience a staggering disparity in arrest rates. Indeed, Blue Bloods isn't a fantasy depiction of how we wish the police could be, it's a reaffirmation of how the show viewers already think they are. Despite these facts, there are those that urge audiences to humanize the policing institution and understand that the role of the police play on screen is wildly different to how they operate in real life. Writer Johnny Nan states in his book Issues and Controversies in Policing Today that police misconduct is often exaggerated and overstated. Police officers often make the claim that news coverage of accused police misconduct, such as brutality, is frequently sensationalized, biased, and taken out of context. Any police officer will state that the use of force never looks good or is acceptable when captured on video. When following proper protocol, news coverage of controversial policies have been criticized for editing videos to fit their narrative. Moreover, today's editorialized news broadcasts in news shows hosted by personalities can present a skewed presentation of the truth. These shows tend to promote the narrative that often draw public attention, such as white officer shoots and kill unarmed Black man. In reality, police don't actually frequently make arrests. Criminologist David Bailey found that patrol officers in America only make 19 arrests per year on average. Police work isn't action-packed and actually involves a lot of paperwork. Police can't, or in some cases won't, solve most crimes. Perhaps one of the greatest impacts of the entertainment industry is raising the public's expectation on the police's abilities. According to The Telegraph, the UK Home Office reported in 2019 that the number of solved crimes was halved on a record low to only 7.4%, stating that police and crime experts blame the fall in charges on shortages of detectives, the increasingly complex investigations, and forces screening out high-volume offenses unlikely to be solved at an earlier stage. And over in the States, the Pew Research Center states that most of the crimes that are reported to the police, at least based on the FBI measure known as the clearance rate. In 2018, police nationwide cleared only 46% of violent crimes that were reported to them. For property crimes, the national clearance rate was only 18%. However, one could argue that due to the dissatisfaction caused by unsolved crimes, coupled with the high police brutality rates, the cultural conversations have shifted the way that the police are presented as the ultimate good guys. And we are now seeing a more nuanced conversation about the power that they have and how they abuse it. For decades, the stories told by Hollywood filmmakers and producers of police and crime dramas have presented largely favorable depictions of police. But the increasing visibility of criminal justice groups, led by young and vocal activists, have started to demand a much more complex look at how the system is portrayed. Writer Orit Kamir writes in his book Framed Women in Law and Film. She explores the dichotomy between women in film and the policing institution. She goes on to explore how these institutions operate on the basis of the patriarchy. The police as an institution operating on the way to male patriarchy comes in direct opposition to the rogue women. For Thelma and Louise, emancipation from police is emancipation from the patriarchy itself. However, Kamir goes on to explore how women of color, particularly black women, are fighting a war on both race and gender. They are hypervisible, leading to brutality and oppression not just enacted by the police, but by their own communities. Kamir states that, like in Thelma and Louise, Frankie and Cleo in the film started off, like Thelma and Louise, choose not to surrender, preferring to die free. But unlike the white woman, they do not make it easy on society, each forcing the authorities to actively shoot her to death. The brutal, overwhelming scenes of their killings spell out the truth about their lives and their deaths. They were cornered in a situation of no exit, and gunned down by a society that views them as less than human. Frankie and Cleo's choices, like Thelma and Louise's before, it expresses the women's ultimate lack of trust in a society and legal system. All of this results in more nuanced take on the way the police are portrayed in cinema. For me, the best example that comes to mind is in Get Out. When Chris is lying over his white girlfriend trying to choke her, Chris, who is the victim and our lead, is terrified when he sees the red and blue flashing lights. In horror films, the signal of the police is meant to mean victory and triumph over the villains. However, when we watch Chris slowly put his arms up, we are reminded that the hero narrative is not true for everyone. To be honest, I think the difference between the heroic depictions of police and the more nuanced portrayals have been more pronounced on platforms outside of broadcast TV, like Netflix and HBO. I think that these nuances come from the idea that Netflix and pay-per-view shows have a commitment to peak TV to portray more nuanced views of the policing force. As the medium of television evolves into a landscape to explore subject matter and genre with a darker and more critical lens. To be honest, I think the difference between the heroic depictions of police and the more nuanced portrayals have been more pronounced on platforms outside of broadcast TV. I think that these nuances come from the idea that Netflix and pay-per-view shows have a commitment to peak TV to portray more nuanced views of the policing force. As the medium of television evolves into a landscape to explore subject matter and genre with a darker and more critical lens, and in the search for subverting expectation tropes and characters which have long been depicted as heroes are now being explored as the opposite. This itself is to be more of how television has evolved as a medium and less of how the actual culture's reaction to what we see on the news. This is because, despite the outrage on social media, prime-time centralized viewings tend to stay away from episodes or topics that center around racial profiling or systematic racism within the police. Writer Dara Lindra writes for Vox that until Black life is valued to the same extent white life is by members of law enforcement and by the criminal justice community, there will be this question of legitimacy of the police and their actions. In all these nuanced takes, we are slowly starting to understand that the police have an unlimited power and resources at their disposal, and they can abuse that power if they want to. But the problem is that many Hollywood narratives frame the abuse of policing power as a heroic and a necessary good, and whoever they kill probably deserved it anyway. And that's because the police themselves built the genre that we are using to absolve them of their crimes. So today, even shows that are trying to be self-critical of the inherent flaws of the cop show, they find themselves doing so using the framework that the police built.
I was harassed as a black man.
Writer Sarah Brady Stiff writes in Origins, an online news article, that perhaps the more troubling unattained goal of the civil rights movement is ending police brutality and the use of deadly force. The desire to be free from disproportionate police violence is as old as the civil rights movement itself. It has been a core part of the agenda of right groups and leaders, from the NAACP to Black Lives Matter. We can never be satisfied as long as black people are the victim of unspeakable horrors and brutality. At the end of it all, the immunity the police are granted on the destruction they cause have been long time celebrated on screen. But we are starting to see that in reality, this destruction and chaos are proof of a corrupt institution with racism at its core.
As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this video. If you liked this video, please like the video and leave a comment down below